Welcome to PowerShell for Beginners. In this lesson, I'm going to walk through PowerShell and we're going to write a simple first script together and then build upon that to learn a few more concepts. Once you're done with this video, I hope you have a basic understanding of PowerShell and you feel comfortable trying it to write some scripts of your own. So with that, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is jump in and start PowerShell, check what version we're on, go through how to update it, and then we'll jump into some basic scripting. So now that we have Windows 10, the first thing we're going to do is jump into PowerShell. To do that, you can click the Start button, type in PowerShell, and you'll see a few options here. I would personally recommend, especially if you're just starting out, that you jump into the ISE, which can give you more of a GUI, if you will, for developing, or IDE for developing, versus just a PowerShell command prompt. I find it a little bit easier to type your programs, see what you're doing, and look at the output all in one place. So let's jump in. We don't need that window. And let's get, here we go. So on the right hand side is where we're going to type our code. The left is where we're going to see the output. If you just went to the prompt, you wouldn't actually have the right hand side where you can type your code, save it, load it, be more efficient. So let's give it a shot. First up, why don't we see what version we are running on this fresh install of Windows 10. With that, we can see we're on version 5.1. So write output. We can put whatever we want for the string, and when we run it, what this is going to do, what write output does is send your text or send your string or whatever it is to standard out, which in this case is going to be to the command prompt. So let's give it a shot. We can run selection if we just selected a certain row and ran it, or we can just run everything in the editor window. For now, we'll do that. You'll notice we get back hello PowerShell. We can expand upon it, run it again. Here it is. You can see how it would work if you were running it from the command prompt, where you would simply type at the PowerShell, you notice the PS, that means we're on the PowerShell command prompt. You could type the command and it would execute it for you that way as well. So let's try taking that string now and writing it to the console 10 times. In order to do this, there's a couple of ways we can go about it. One that I'm calling the PowerShell way is to use the iterator and feed it into the output. Then there's an old school way, if you're used to programming with for next loops, where you have something similar in PowerShell. And the last part we'll get into in a few minutes. Okay, so let's jump into it. I am going to do it the PowerShell way. So let me hide presentation. Okay. So we have our original program where we put whatever text we wanted to out to the screen. Now we want to do it 10 times. We're merely going to say from 1 to 10 pipe, which in PowerShell is the command to say take the output from what's on the left and use it as the input to what's immediately on the right. This is going to take the numbers from 1 to 10, and I'm going to use a %sign, which is a shortcut for each, and we'll get into that in a second. So what this is basically saying is from 1 to 10, for each number, write output, hello PowerShell, this is my first program. So the first time it will say 1, write output, and then 2, write output. So we should see it. If this worked right, come to the screen 10 times. And there it is. Now, instead of using the abbreviation, you can rather note, let's see, for each, and run it. So that might be a little more verbose. The %sign is again just a PowerShell shortcut. I'm going to use it just to shorten the code as much as possible, but use whatever you are more comfortable with. Alright, now that we've done that, let's just say you want to make it a little more useful as you can be with writing text to the screen, and say you want to know what iteration it's on. So to do that, you are going to use a new variable that we're going to call $_. Let's just put it at the start of the line. So what this would say is the first time $_ is going to take the current variable, if you will, in the for each clause. So it will be 1 the first time around, it'll be 2 the second time around, and so on. So if we run this, you will see for each iteration now, we get 1 through 10, and we get the text. So that is a brief introduction to really writing text out to the screen, or writing output out to the standard output, and iterating through something. Alright, next up we are going to write a string to a console X times. So what does that mean? That means we're going to take some user input. We're going to ask basically how many times do you want us to print this, and based on your answer we are going to print it. So let's jump in and give that a shot. Alright, again, working off of our current program, we already have it printing out 10 times. So let's first create a variable called iter, or iteration, which is just going to store the answer to how many times you want to write to the screen. We're going to use a new PowerShell command called read host, which is just going to take your input from the command line and store it into that variable. So enter number of iterations. So we're going to ask how many iterations, and then to run it that many times, we're going to change this to go from 1 to number of iterations. Understand, we are not doing a lot of validation here. So because of that, you could put in numbers that would cause a problem. For example, 1 to number of iterations. If you put a 0 or put a negative number, I don't think that will work out. We can certainly try it and see how that goes, but let's give this a run. You notice it's asking us how many iterations we want to run. Let's say we want to go 5 times. There we go, it ran 5 times. If we run it again, let's say we want to run it 0 times, and yeah, that didn't work out very well. So that's where checking logic and handling those situations will come into play. Unfortunately, that is out of the scope of today's lesson, but we can certainly dig into that a little deeper in a future video. I'm curious what happens with a negative number, so let's give that a shot. Alright. Interesting how it works. So it worked backwards. There you have it. So if we put 0, it goes from 1 to 0. So it will write for 1 and it writes for 0. Negative 11, it again started at 1 and worked backwards to negative 11. So interesting logic. We can figure out how we want to deal with that in the future. Alright, so now we have mastered getting user input, or at least learned how to get user input. Now let's grab data from a file. Another thing you'll commonly want to do. I find a lot of times it's very useful to know how to read in a CSV file. Microsoft does have some great documentation on PowerShell, so I provided a link here on this page, but we are going to jump into basically creating a CSV file and then importing it, and with that imported object, seeing what variables are available to us, and then printing it out as a formatted table. So that sounds like a lot. Let's jump into it. Okay, so first up, we want to or need to have a CSV file to work with. To do that, I am going to use the get process command. And what this is going to do is export all the current running processes on your computer and save them to a CSV file. So if we run this, you will see that we now have a CSV file. Okay, I'm going to delete that CSV file, and we're going to keep going. So the next thing we want to do is, well, import the CSV file. I could have left it there and not repeated the process of creating it, but that's all right. Okay, so we're going to create a variable. We're going to call it $P for process, and we're going to tell it import CSV. And this time we're going to reference the file that is created in the first step. Now if we run this, you won't see anything because it's just importing the CSV into a variable. So from there, let's just say we want to take $P, which is the variable we created to hold the CSV file. It'll put it into an object, and let's see what fields are available to us. So to do that, we're going to run get member. Now let's give this a shot. It's going to first import, export, then import. Okay, and now you see from that we have a lot of fields. So as you scroll through this list, these are all the different properties that you can get from the processes.csv file that was imported. So you can pick the fields you are interested in and display those. For now, we are going to use the format table just to use whatever default it has chosen for us. So once again, we are exporting to a CSV, then importing that CSV, and now we're looking at the format table command, which by default has chosen to show us the name, some fields that I'm not sure what exactly they mean, and the path. So you've heard me talk about it. We can simplify this by knowing exactly what we want and thinking about how PowerShell works. So the pipe command is very powerful, taking the output of one command, using it as the input to the next command. So if we already have an existing CSV file, we wouldn't need to do the first line. We would need to import the CSV. So if we take this, so we're importing the CSV rather than creating a variable to use. If all we want to do is show the table, we could do this and obviate the need for everything else. Import CSV and then process table, and we should ultimately get the same result. Except it's called format table. There we go. So we got the same result, fewer steps, just by understanding how PowerShell works. Okay, now let's jump into how to select which output or what fields we want from that CSV file to actually display. So in this next example, we are going to use what we've already done, but just grab certain fields out of that CSV file to display on the screen. So let's jump into it. Alright, back to our example. You will see that we've simplified it. So all we actually have to do to grab specific fields is, if you remember the get member variable. So if we, I don't think it will let us, but let's find out. No, okay. If we remember before, using the get member variable, what we could do is, well, let's have a run for it. Let's first take a look at what variables are available to us from this CSV file. Looking at this, just for the sake of our purposes, I am going to grab the description field, because that would definitely be interesting, and I'm going to grab the name field so we know exactly what we're talking about. I'm not going to worry about the rest. Feel free to play around with them a little bit though and see what information is useful for you. So given that, we can come back here, and instead of do get member, we're going to do, hope I remember it right this time, format table, and we're going to grab the fields. So properties, you'll notice a lot of the ones on here say note property. Well, we're going to grab properties, and the ones we want are name and description. So if we run this, ideally we will get a table that just shows the name and description. And there it is, the name of the process and the description of the process. Okay, the next thing we want to do is save our output to a CSV file. To do that, let's start fresh, just for some reinforcement. We are going to start with importing the CSV file. To do that, we will type import CSV, and the path will be data processes.csv. Once we have the CSV file loaded, we won't use a variable. We're going to make this all work in one line. So we are going to then pipe the input or pipe the output of that CSV file into a select object. So rather than using format table, which we did when we were originally just displaying this CSV file on the screen, since we want to take the object and push it out to a file, instead this time we're going to do select object to pull what we want out of it. In this case, just like before, we're still going to say property, and we're going to grab name and description. So you'll note, just like using the format table, it looks really identical. I'm sure there are some nuances, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So with that, we want to now take this output and save it to our CSV file, a new CSV file. So what we're going to do, and you've probably already guessed it, is we're going to use export CSV, and in this case we will call it path export.csv. So with that, if we run this and take a look, you'll see we now have an export CSV file. And if we just take a quick look at it, it has our name and description of all of our processes. As an extra bonus here, remember what you can do is, if you really are just looking for processes rather than importing the CSV, you can simply run the get process command and keep everything else the same. If we were to run that and take a look, it will have updated our export.csv. So you do not need to run the import of a file. If you've created it from something like get processes, you can just run get processes again. Okay, next let's talk about measuring. Let's say you want to know how long a process is taking. One thing you can do is in PowerShell is wrap that command within a measure command statement. So let's give that a shot with our import export example. So to do this, as you see on the slide, you'll use the measure command and put your command that you're measuring within it, and then finally run a select object command to tell it what object from that measure command do you actually want. You have a lot of options: total milliseconds, total seconds, minutes, hours, days. In our case, we know it's not going to run that long. We're just going to take a look at total milliseconds, which is how many milliseconds it took for our process to run. So let's check it out. All right, here we have our command from before, and what we're going to do is wrap it with the measure command. So if we do measure command, all right, we've now wrapped it with the measure command, and from that we're also going to select object total. All right, and now if we run this, we will see that it ran in about 35 milliseconds. Very quick, but that's a great utility if you want to time something that you're running. So I know this was a short lesson today, but a quick summary of what we've learned. We've learned how to get your current version of PowerShell. Again, you can just type $PS version table.ps version to find out what that is. You can use winget if it's on your system to update PowerShell. Otherwise, if you go to the Microsoft site, there's options to download the latest version, or I believe it even walks you through how to set up your Windows update, so it will also update the PowerShell version. The write output command, which will write some text or other output to the standard out, whatever that might be. By default, it tends to be the screen. We've learned how to iterate using 1.10 or X to Y, or you can use the for loop. We didn't really dig into that because I think it's much more convenient to use the X to Y, but whichever you prefer. We went through the $_ which is an alias to PS item, and that refers to the current item in the pipe. So that was useful when we looked at the iterate loop from X to Y, and while it was going through from X to Y, the $_ was referencing the current item it was on, so we were able to print that out. The pipe command itself, key to writing very concise PowerShell scripts, which basically takes the output of one command and passes it to the next. We went through the read host command to take user input. We went through variables initially, where we put $P for process and did the import CSV, so it stored it in that variable. We showed the get process command to get processes. There's so many others that are available through PowerShell. You can try writing some of your own programs using, for example, get service. We'll show you a list of all your services that are on the computer. We went through the export and import CSV commands. Very handy for working with CSV files, something where, you know, if you're in IT or work with files a lot, you probably have to do a lot of work with CSV files. We went over the get member command to show what attributes of an object are available. So if you ever have a command that returns an object and want to know what's in it, you can run the get member command off of it. We went through format table, which is a way to print out a formatted table. We looked at the measure command to show how long something takes. We also talked about select object, which in some ways, for today's examples, seemed almost the same as format table. We can dig more into the future when it comes to some of the differences between the two. And then a last note, we went through the %sign, which is an alias for the for each object. So that allowed us to, again, when we iterated, you know, for each instance of the item, do something. So with that, I want to thank you all for taking the time and watching today. I hope you learned something. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. If there's anything you'd like to see in the future, please throw me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested in following me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is @EdBorowski71. Thank you so much.